A massive shout out to the Jonan tier member Mr. Leroy 1998 and Jenan tier Leah Rov. Your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, support the channel, as well as receive special perks and access exclusive series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. Hi guys, this is the next part of What If Wendy Didn't Get Frozen in Time? Written by LastStationLover 5000, brought to you by Ray What If. I hope you enjoy. Waters in the distance, the various cries of mammals, the singing and chirping of birds high in the canopies. If anything, these sounds spurred her on. Wendy needed courage right now. The energy the forest provided her aside, her thoughts dwelt on Charles, so Wendy listened to the sounds of the hunters, the predators making their kills in the dense cover of the trees. And used it to fuel her, honing in completely on the scent of the generous Robin and his merry men. For Charles, Wendy, become a dragon. Her thoughts burned like fire in her mind, the young dragon slayer pushing herself forward. These Robin hoodlums certainly chose a clever place to conceal themselves, assessed Dorenbolt. Without Wendy's nose, we'd be running blind through this forest. In fact, I'd say that, without a dragon slayer, it'd be difficult to traverse this place safely. Max shuddered. That's a terrifying thought. This lot are already difficult enough, but to use this place as cover without a dragon slayer. You're making them out to be monsters, Dorenbolt. They are, in their own way, interjected Arcadios. Monsters willing to destabilize countries for the sake of their own self-worth. He was so self-assured when he spoke, I almost felt like I could believe him, Max admitted. He's not entirely wrong when he said that Fairy Tail is a reckless guild. We're known for recklessness, property damage, and causing general unrest, even if we do get the job done. Wendy nodded solemnly. She hadn't been with the guild as long, but its reputation preceded itself. The generous Robin hadn't spoken lies when he'd ticked off what he'd considered to be their offenses. Dorenbolt ruefully agreed internally. Fairy Tail was certainly a thorn in the side of the council, causing the most trouble possible for a legal guild, while still staying within the lines of the law enough that they rarely interfered with Fairy Tail, and could merely grumble behind the scenes. After spending a week with the guild and Wendy, however, Dorenbolt felt that the council may have been misguided. He'd even spoken in Fairy Tail's defense long before this. And yet the very rulers of Fury sought you, replied Arcadios severely. Fairy Tail may have a reputation for recklessness, but to Fury, your guild has remained the symbol of power and hope for years. Her Grace and His Majesty themselves are very taken with your guild, very much indeed, for whatever this, Robin may have said about you, he has only fed you one side of the story. Perhaps you should look at it from the other side as well. Wendy was briefly silenced. At first, she didn't think words would appropriately be able to express her gratitude to Arcadios for this. It wasn't enough to shatter her doubt, but it did bolster her confidence. Thank you. The remainder of the journey was a silent one, however, the hearts of the party had been struck with renewed fervor. Arcadios' words made their goal seem feasible. Navigating through the woods, Wendy felt the scent of her target spike in her nose, triggering her to come to a stop. She raised a hand, signaling the others, and quietly held a finger to her mouth, indicating the need for quiet. Her companions' questioning looks were answered by a thin finger, Wendy pointing just over a sloping hill. Keeping themselves low, pressing their bodies into the foliage, the group peered down over the incline. There they were, the Robin hoodlums' entire camp. Wendy's eyes were better than the others, having the sight of a dragon, and she could see, even among the no-names that she knew nothing about, the figures of the enemies they encountered back at Mercurius Castle. Moreover, their scents were the strongest. Dragons could smell strength as well as traditional odor, and the main group radiated power in a way the lesser underlings simply didn't, so pinpointing them was easier. The generous Robin was even easier. To Wendy, his smell was sweet, like syrup. She associated this scent now with danger, and instinctively took a crawl backwards. How are we going to approach this? Asked Max, eyeing Wendy carefully. I'm not sure, replied Wendy. They're all alert right now. I can sense panic in their smell, though it isn't from us. I don't even think they know we're here. We'll strike by night, whispered Dorenbolt, as if it were the world's most obvious answer. Covert. That was the term we used to describe this mission. Our goal isn't an all-out brawl, so we wait for nightfall, and strike when the security of the enemy is at its weakest, when their weapons lay forgotten and their guard has been dropped. Wendy nodded, and Max clapped his hands, earning a look of ire from everyone present, and he apologized quickly for the excess noise. "That's a great idea, Doranbolt," replied Arcadios. "I'd expect such of a former rune knight. Normally, my honor as a knight of the kingdom would not allow for such underhanded tactics. But the state of the kingdom is at stake, and her grace is relying on us to see this mission through. For her sake, I will throw aside honor." "I don't really like it either," replied Wendy, her eyes shifting between her friends and the enemy camp down below. "But it's the best chance we've got for my plan to work." "Nighttime it is. Let's get some rest," suggested Doranbolt. "No reason to attack them when we're exhausted. I'll take first watch," and opened her mouth, chomping down on it, eating the blade of wind that came from the hilt of the weapon. "She isn't," he uttered aloud, his cherub face paling as she saw from this distance her swallowing a lump down her throat. "Sky dragons," Wendy began to inhale, her body inflating around her flat upper torso towards her neck. And then, hilariously, she let out a raucous belch. "Oorp," she spewed out, a gaseous blast of sky dragon magic, unrefined and chaotic, slamming the man along with a slew of the cohorts caught in its cyclone's wake. Slamming the tents, the campfires and a good number of the hoodlums into the hill that Robin stood upon, it crashed with a resounding boom, fragmenting it and shaking it violently. Oh my," Aris blinked, her face sweating as Bobby stifled a snicker with a hand placed over her mouth. "I didn't think she was the real deal, but that cements it," Robin stated seriously, icily staring down at Wendy from the distance separating them, now surrounded by a swath of unconscious and brutalized bodies of his merry men. "Wendy Marvell really is a bona fide dragon slayer, let's make her a priority target." As those words left his mouth, he'd feel something unnatural transpire. Air being displaced by mass that once didn't exist, replacing it and moving with incredible momentum. Through sheer instinct he turned around to swipe at it with a gloved left hand, severing the ground through sheer release of magical energy. What he saw was the outline of a shimmering silhouette, evading him entirely but not striking back. A sudden lack of weight over his cyan-colored crown made him realize something. Reaching up to tuck at the brim of his hat he'd find its lip absent, along with the rest of its comfortable fabric. Gaping, he turned around and saw a familiar scarred man having leapt away, his back turned towards the three as he maneuvered like a human javelin towards the other three attackers at the front of the hoodlums' camp. "Hey, he's got it," Max cried out with a jovial smile. "Doranbolt," Wendy let out a relieved cry. "Hold fast," Arcadios encouraged, keeping himself reserved as he tried to keep watch of any other straggling hoodlums they hadn't yet bested. "It'll take him a few moments to whisk us all home. Be ready for a last-second act of desperation." "They weren't here for us," Robin processed, his eyes shrinking to pins, his teeth grinding against each other and his incisors baring almost fairly. Pupils within his eyes threatened to turn into slits instead of their normal spherical shape, his magical energy unleashed in a swirling pyre of teal-silver light. "They were after their damn treasure the whole time." "Orders?" Bobby inquired stonily, seemingly unfazed by these events and looking up expectantly at the androgynous youth. "Bring me my hat back," he ordered, his voice seething as he turned his back to his two lieutenants, walking back to the tree to grasp his icicle-shaped stave. "By any means necessary." Bobby's countenance shifted upon the wording of his command. A normally placid expression of stoicism gave way to a wide-eyed glare that poised towards the back of Doranbolt that just touched down in front of his comrades. Coiling her thick luscious thighs, muscles became defined and fluctuated, her upper body swaying as she bent her back and head in a limber U-shape. Then, in a flash of light, she lunged straight towards the four, smashing into the earth with a viscous splash of fiery blackness. What?" Max cried out, his hands crisscrossing to defend his face, the enchantment protecting him but still forcing him back a considerable distance. Arcadios grimaced, finding himself grinding at his heels if only because of his heavier personage. Wendy herself tumbled backwards, righting herself up in a somersault as she looked up with fear in her eyes. Spiked up, enhancing her outline in a blackened silhouette of supernatural might harnessed from her indignant rage. "For every bit of humiliation I've endured because of you, you'll pay. For all of it. You'll have to get in line." Brutalia, a deep hum came from the attractive but almost just as disheveled man that walked from the opposite end of the camp that she did. His breastplate had marks of mud, his head no longer combed but a messy mop, and his eyes stared with a pair of pins for pupils towards them. His pronounced chin shook with his gritted teeth as he forced a smile, his own amethyst energies spewing into the air as either hand trembled at his sides. I want to rip them into pieces for what their friend did to my mind. Their entry into the fray didn't surprise the fairy tale mages. They had an impression that was hard to forget. Handsome's bloodlust and surprising durability made him a foe to be feared for all of the most obvious reasons. Meanwhile, Brutalia's exceptional mastery over a magic like telekinesis made her an even more dangerous foe. But their current demeanor spoke of a wound to their pride and a break in their composure. Though they were strong, that meant they weren't fighting at their best. With a look between each other without words exchanged, they knew they had a chance of defeating them now. "You two, stop that," Oris chided, her voice coming off as motherly as she floated over their heads, coated in a veil of blue light that permeated from the halo behind her pinkish hair. "This is no time to act independently. Let the leader decide how best to deal with these interlopers. Do as you wish, don't correct me, you bowl-haired Neanderthal," Brutalia shrieked, hurling her boulders with a forward clap of her sullied dress sleeves. At seeing this, the pair acted in accordance. The cobalt-haired Sky Maiden ran up the side of Max's back and, with a boost of his arms, leapt gracefully into the air through several revolutions of her green-skirted frame. In those rotations she gathered the enriched air of the Jade Mountains, coalescing it in a swath of visibly teal wind. Drifting it up over her head, she swung it down, sending a powerful gust of wind that slammed into the ground, exploding the boulders and creating a massive cloud of dirt to rise up into the air to obscure the three fighters. While the Princess of Pain winced at her attack being nullified and her senses blinded, she swore she heard running. A brush of her hands, she willed the dust away, just in time to see Max running straight towards her with surprising speed. "Why you?" Brutalia snarled, whipping her hand around to halt his approach. The instant she thrust her palm towards face, two things occurred. 1. She felt the earth beneath her give way, as if it was no longer solid. Her heels sunk with a dry slick sound, and her aim diverted to upheaving the air just above the man's head. The second that happened, was that she felt the whole of her body thrusting up into the air, held fast by a twisting cyclone of sand. An unintelligible cry was heard from her as she'd be brought up substantially into the sky of the forest-filled valley of the mountains before summarily thrown down with a significant thump, the shockwave sending a blistering wind that brought the generous Robin's locks flourishing back along with Eris's. "And that is what happens when you don't look at anything but ahead," Max chided, smiling at the sight of sand coating the campsite, a pair of heeled feet sticking upwards with slight twitching being noticeable. "A bit of sand wrapping around those boulders, and I flood sandstorm into the broken-up soil. Once I've filled it with sand, it was just a matter of getting close and hitting you with a point-blank sand rebellion. Thanks to Wendy, you didn't see me coming until the last second." Landing softly beside him, the man turned with a broad smile and raised his hand. She met it with a high five, the two giggling despite their current situation. Pardon me," a voice breached the pair's victory, making them look over at Arcadios as he was submerged in the sand with only his head sticking up, looking humorously like a brown bush of his wild hair on his angular face, sticking up from the ground. The two did their best to not snicker as he cleared his throat and asked with a visible sign of wincing humiliation. "May you please unearth me? Your magic caught me in the crossfire." "Sorry about that, Sir Arcadios," Wendy meekly apologized, rushing up with Max casually walking behind her. Digging up the sand around him, the two hoisted him up by the underarms, and with a heave, they pulled him straight out of the dry grains of earth that now covered the battlefield. Where's Handsome?" Max inquired, his head turning left and right trying to look for the man. "I lost sight of him," sending him booting back only for Wendy and Max to stabilize him with a wind-propelled layer of sand to buffet him. "Let's team up against this guy," Max proffered. "Yeah, he doesn't seem to care he's wounded," Wendy noted, grimacing at the sight of blood spilling freely from the murderer's chest as he pursued Arcadios once he rose up to challenge his strikes. "I concur," the Lily Knight replied, gritting his teeth as he met blow for blow the perceived slew of attacks his adversary was unleashing. "Let us bring down this savage and then leave this place." Drums. A cacophony of beats thrummed within the earth. The sensation rattled beneath their feet, pulsing visibly across the sandy ground that Max had created. Struggling to stand atop it, they all wobbled on their feet with Handsome even staggering to keep his massive physique stable. Before they could utter inquiries what it was, Wendy smelled it. Bloodlust. It rose up into the air ahead of a crimson devil sliding up from the tens of thousands of grains that was their floor. Shoving it away from a swirling vortex of scarlet light came up the whipping hair of the Princess of Pain herself. Grinding teeth together with a loud crackling sound, A pupilless pair of eyes glared as she levitated into the air, a storm of sand spiraling around her as she held her hands up in a clawed pair of gestures. Clenching them into fists, the sand coalesced, the friction of pressure of her blood-lit magic transforming it from one substance, and straight into glittering, sharpened gems that formed spears of diamonds that numbered up to a dozen evenly distributed on either side of her floating form. "You, miserable ants," Brutallia hissed aloud, throwing her fists outward in the shape of knives with her fingers, discharging the pressure-borne gems akin to missiles towards the three. "Become dust." Sky Dragon's wave. Wendy thrust her palm out, unleashing an arc of wind from her arm to derail the spiraling blades of crystals Brutallia had crafted. Grazing her cheek, left arm and side, the explosions they caused from impacting on the far side of the camp rattled her inside. Following up, Max threw a fist out, unleashing a pillar of sandstorm magic at the crazed telekinetic. Despite crashing into her body, the woman let out a scream that released a crimson wave of light that pushed it back. Throwing a punch, a visible fist of intangible energy discharged that he narrowly avoided, exploding the ground from the force of its momentum. "You two, defend yourselves," Arcadios declared, deflecting his takeover mage's attacks. "We must buy Doranbold time to get the nation's treasure to a place they can't reach." "Threefold enchantment," Wendy cried out, layering it over herself, Max and Arcadios as soon as he said it. They had neared the end of their uses of this invaluable increase to offense, defense and speed. It wasn't nearly as strong as it could be, which she admitted aloud while biting her lower lip. "I wish I could do a double layer, but I need to fight too, please, bear with it, Max." "Sir Arcadios. Don't worry about us, Wendy," Max cried out, evading another series of visible telekinetic fists thrown out by Brutallia. "Just keep yourself together. We need you in one piece, alright?" "Right," Wendy shouted with a brave smile, leaping up throwing out arcing gusts of wind that forced Brutallia back, as Arcadios himself swung in fervor to counter his own maddening opponent's offensive strokes. "I promised Charl I'd come back, no matter what." End. A flame of onyx formed from the palm of her covered hand, ejecting what looked like a pyre of something that slowly wrapped itself into a more solid shape. Once it began to create a cross-shaped handle, a single edge appeared out of the shadows, and the weapon itself was visible to the eye. With the light of the moon gleaming down, he'd bear witness to an elegant wakizashi with a pentacle-shaped guard, all retaining a burning darkness that permeated from its very makeup. "With Kajesan, I'll tear you apart, teleporter," Bobby proclaimed, swinging the blade around in a spinning flourish to ceremoniously divide her now visible visage. "Accept your defeat with dignity, lest I take you apart. One piece at a time." Swinging her weapon, a mass of blackness sprouted from the razor edge, shooting into the air and flowing around all angles. Strings of darkness filled the scarred man's vision. Flourishing around in an unpredictable series of trajectories, her weapon strokes belied the true nature of her magic, arcs of shadow creating a web of darkness that cut off the most obvious avenues of escape. With direct line, he maneuvered behind her, turning about to swing a foot at her. Only to see the webs of blackness erupt from the space behind her, warping away from the spot it once was sailing towards him a moment ago. "Her magic is teleporting too," he thought, backpedaling with another jolt of his magic to avoid the seeking snare of shadow. In doing so, he watched with his own eyes as the exact instant he did, the darkness spiraled out of place and back towards him, now even closer than it was before. Repeating this, he found himself in a maddening chase across the mountain valley, having lost sight of the assassin-equipped mage. Darting about, he'd eventually sense her presence behind him. A sharp thrust came into his shoulder, piercing his body and jabbing through his shoulder out his striped tunic on the other side. Even as he threw an elbow back at her in retaliation, she whisked away like smoke, leaving him to be heading straight first into the web of shadows, all that sunk into his clothing and slashed into his skin. HNGH. He winced, one eye grimacing shut as blood spout from his sleeves up his jacket and across his chest. "Let go," Bobby snarled, reappearing above and swinging her blade in a fiery line of eviscerating shadow. "Or die." Instead of avoiding the blow, Doranbold looked up defiantly with his open eye and grasped the weapon around the pentacle guard and over her hand. With Bobby's eyes widened in surprise, she saw him pull with surprising strength and twist around the balls of his heels, teleporting straight into the base of a mountain where he'd slam her shadow-enraptured body with a vicious crack. "Gah!" Bobby gasped out. With the wind knocked from her lungs, she found herself open for a follow-up as her enemy jettisoned the two of them across the valley vista, thrashing her through one boulder and then another. Each time Bobby sensed pain radiate from her body as his persistent contact made it impossible for her to transmute into darkness. And then, after the seventh impact, she unleashed a bodily pulse of darkness from her whole being. "Enough," she shouted, forcing him to skid backwards, his dominant arm raised to protect his face while his blood-covered left arm held the pointed hat of the generous Robin still firmly in his grasp. Both took time to regain their breaths, eyeing each other as blood and bruises marred their persons. "This isn't usually my style," the scarred man admitted, breaking the pause in the air between them. "I'm normally not the kind of man to fight with my all. Only when I find a significant criminal in my sights, or when there's no other choice, do I ever engage in combat." "Then why don't you surrender already?" Bobby inquired, her eyes blinking with confusion. "Every fiber of my being is telling me to complete my objective. To run and bring this hat back to Crocus. But," Dorenbolt grabs the hem of the cloth and opened his mouth wide, stuffing it till it was nothing but a ball of enchanted fabric. Sweating profusely, eyes watering, Bobby watched aghast as the whole magical hat into his throat and down as a lump straight out of sight into his gullet. Gasping, and choking back an urge to vomit, Dorenbolt smiled grimly as he raised up both of his hands and smacked one fist into an open palm. "You've forced me into a corner, be prepared for a real fight with a mage of fairy tale." The sight of the hat being fully ingested brought about a look of pure, unadulterated rage on Bobby's face. Veins throbbed across her brow and down her scraped face, teeth gnashed and the whole of her voluptuous and partially exposed person undulated with a revolution of blackness emitting from her requip. "You'll pay for that," she howled, leaping forward with her blade brandished in a slashing arc poised towards his face. Direct line, Dorenbolt thought, his eyes widening as he timed for the exact instant her blade was about to touch his skin. Instead of maneuvering to a flank, or behind her, he throttled forward and slammed his forehead straight into hers. The unorthodox blow split her forehead open, bruising his own sturdy cranium. Taking advantage of her unsteady disposition, he zigzagged around her, throwing punches that all coincided in concert around her form. One hit her in the ribs, another struck the base of her neck and the third dug into her scraped jawline. Grimacing at this, she dissolved into shadow at the end of the triage of attacks, ending his combo. Just as she ported below him, she'd see 5 shimmering replicas of Dorenbolt all throwing punches down towards her face, lunging away at the last second. A visible explosion of earth being expunged by the force of 5 full-powered straight jabs shocked her. In the span of her watching it, she'd see him reappear in front of her, eyes glaring straight into her orbs. Baring her teeth, she swung Kajessen in a swift arc, only for him to duck beneath its cutting stroke of midnight onyx flame. A swift upward teleport brought his knee crashing into her face, halting her sword stroke and rattling her skull with the additional momentum of instantaneous movement. "Your mystic eye curse is a pale imitation of true teleportation," he intoned, twisting around to slam the shin of his right leg into the side of her head, sending her spiraling away. Just in time for him to land a forward jab as he shifted in front of her flying frame, his knuckles grinding into her flinging body and sending her painfully thrust back the way she was sent flying off her feet. "You can only teleport when you're not attacking, and it takes concentration on top of it. You can make yourself intangible, and even latch your offensive spells onto me when I retreat. It's a true assassin's magic. Not meant for a brawl with someone of a high caliber in speed and reflexes." "So what of it?" Bobby lashed out, twisting her body around and clawed at the earth before catapulting herself straight at him with a harry of vicious strikes, coated in shadow magic. Each time she aimed he deftly wove himself around, not even teleporting as her strikes couldn't sink into him like they once did. "As long as I draw breath, I'll keep coming. You're already wounded, and that enchantment won't last long enough for you to finish the job." "On that we can agree," Dorenbolt replied, backhanding her blade's thrust by its flat, before he grasped her arm and looked straight upward to the moonlit sky. "It's time we end this farce." A shunt of space was made, and the two were no longer within the valley. High above in the sky 2 dots formed. Upon closer view, one could see Dorenbolt and Bobby were now high in the sky, tens of thousands of feet in altitude above where the Jade Mountains was viewed. Bobby's already heavy breathing soon turned into gasps, not just from the change in scenery, as the oxygen surrounding her immediate perspective was drained to near zero. "No," she croaked out, swinging her blade towards the scarred man only to find him teleporting along her flank while throttling a punch straight into her diaphragm. The high-velocity impact brought what air was within her lungs, and she found darkness creeping into her eyes of the metaphorical kind. Reaching a hand out, she desperately tried to claw at him, only to find gravity and the lack of air surrounding her brought her to an immediate state of unconsciousness. In a swift return to the earth below, Dorenbolt gasped for his own breath, dropping to his hands and knees. Gah. Wah. Too high, never doing that again. He exclaimed, beating sweat dripping onto the ground as the light of enchantment fizzled out from his form. Pushing himself back to his feet, he cast a wary glance at the unconscious Bobby, grimacing as he took stock of how narrow this win truly was. Under normal circumstances, you probably would have aimed to kill rather than incapacitate. If it wasn't for the hat, I probably would have been dead. But this time, he admitted, grinning despite himself as he looked into the horizon, raising his fist into the air as he yelled loudly. Victory is mine. Mercurius castle piercing, raging waves. A liquid spiral, piercing the body of a young girl. The girl's body rode the current of the spiraling drill, her blood tainting the waters red. Before the eyes of someone who struggled to comprehend what was happening, Wendy Marvell's body collapsed in a heap, lifeless and growing still. The sound of ragged breathing, shouts and screams, filled Charlie's ears as she woke with a start. That premonition again, Charles shuddered in horror. Only, there was more this time. Worried, the Exceed turned her head to the outside window, taking in the light of the moon. Wendy, what's happening? One of them I consider the most important of all. It appears I will need to break it now. A rule? Inquired Dorenbolt curiously. What rule is that? Avoiding needless slaughter, snarled Robin. He raised his staff high above his head, his aura moving with it, beginning to focus it solely at the tip of the rod. The temperature in the air dropped considerably, traces of water beginning to glint and turn to frost. Breath became visible and white in the air. Get down, Eris ordered to Handsome and Brutalia, who needed no telling twice. The battles were happening close enough that, when Robin struck, the two would be struck down along with Wendy and Max. Handsome and Brutalia took cover, distanced with their respective magics, leaving Wendy, Max and Arcadios alone. Wendy, Max, to me, Dorenbolt ordered, feeling the wind shift, becoming even more frigid. Above Robin's staff, a massive, diamond-shaped construct, entirely made of ice, formed. They recognized it immediately. It was the same icicle spear that Robin had easily blown the gate of the vault open with. Even as they ran, there was still enough distance between Max, Wendy, and Dorenbolt which Robin could take advantage of. Shit, I can't wait for them. Dorenbolt focused on Wendy first, his body moving even as he thought the name of his spell. Direct line took him to her in seconds, and Dorenbolt scooped her up with a single arm. He held out a hand for Max, who grabbed it firmly, the bull-haired man placing all of his trust in the person he'd formerly considered untrustworthy. Arcadios, with no hand to reach for, quickly placed an armored limb on Dorenbolt's shoulder. All three were firmly holding onto Dorenbolt now. You won't get way, snarled Robin, his voice monstrous. With a gesture, the gargantuan ice spike began to spiral, drilling through air, shrieking towards the trio. Dorenbolt looked Robin dead in the eye. The split second of a glare the two shared conveyed multiple emotions, loathing, contempt, rage, desperation, before he focused entirely on where they were headed. Direct line. In that instant, the ice spear crashed where Fairy Tale had been, yet Dorenbolt had vanished from Robin's sight. Silence followed. Robin stared blankly at the space where his attack had only barely missed. The ice spear emitting a soft frost, and yet it bore no blood. No gore splattered the ground. He knew he had failed. With only his soldiers and followers to hear, the young man let out a blood-curdling howl of rage, echoing throughout the Jade Mountains. It continued, beyond the lung capacity of any human. It sounded like a raging beast. You promised to be my friend. And I take care of my friends. Her voice quavered. So, take care of yourself for me too, please. Look after yourself, and I'll do the rest. Just don't risk yourself needlessly like this again. Her words shook him. While he had been prepared to be her friend from the start, to look after her, to make sure she could cope with the loss of her friends, he felt entirely responsible for being the reason she'd even been exposed to it. He was going to take it entirely on himself. He was supposed to be her friend, not her bodyguard. Dorenbolt smiled gently, a trait which complemented his youthful, if scarred, face. "You're right, I shouldn't cause my friend to worry like this," replied the former rune knight. "I'll protect myself better from now on. You don't need to worry about that, Wendy." "Thank you," was all Wendy said, continuing to apply her magic towards Doranbolt's wounds. "I'm glad I asked Charles to stay behind," Wendy thought to herself. "Doranbolt is the most skilled out of all of us, and if he got hurt this badly, it could have been worse for Charles." Wendy couldn't bear to lose anyone else now. But she also knew that, if she became stronger, she could fix that. Internally, however, the Dragon Slayer magic resolved to do better. Her enchantments hadn't been strong enough if they'd allowed Doranbolt to get hurt. If Doranbolt could vow to not ever get hurt again, then Wendy would vow to make certain no one else ever did either. With renewed determination, Wendy set to work finishing Doranbolt's treatment. Crafted by the Lazuli family. True to their secretive nature, only those of the Lazuli blood can properly use this hat. We cannot force it to reveal its secrets, much less part with a single coin. The Lazuli family, the name of the family instilled a reaction in everyone in the room, everyone but little Wendy, who looked at each face with visible confusion on hers. A buzz filled the room, quickly silenced by the raising of Hisui's hand, yet the atmosphere remained astonished all the same. Doranbolt spoke first. "The Lazuli family?" he inquired again. "Even I've heard the name," added Max. "Though I've never been too curious as to what they do." "Who are the Lazuli family?" Wendy asked, not wanting to be rude by butting in but growing more curious. She had no idea who they were, though she assumed this came from her sheltered life before meeting and joining the Fairy Tale Guild. "The Lazuli family," supplied Doranbolt. "They're considered the foremost developers artisans in the field of crafting magical tools, and their name is known throughout the Pergrand Kingdom. I know them by reputation, as well as documents stored within the Magic Council, detailing official dealings with the family. They're high enough up on the totem pole of society that the magical government itself considers them vital to our infrastructure, though I haven't a clue what the council needed them for. But if this hat is a Lazuli magical item..." Arcadios thoughtfully placed a hand towards his chin. "Then the young lass, no lad, who wields it must be of the Lazuli family's blood. That's the only explanation. But why would a member of such a distinguished lot be running around as the leader of a brigand outfit?" "The Lazuli family is a secretive clan," said Hisui. "Only the patriarch ever shows his face to the public. We know he has children and took a wife, but we've never seen his family. So this boy is a renegade Lazuli. He must have had an interesting history." "This changes the mission entirely," Doranbolt said grimly. "We thought we were clever, having won that little game of capture the flag. But the generous Robin outwitted us. If only a Lazuli can activate this hat. Then our priority is capturing him," finished Hisui, almost as if to make it an official order. "It troubles me to send you out so soon after your mission, but capturing the generous Robin should be our priority. I only ask you that rest before you head out again, and otherwise prepare yourselves for the mission to capture him alive and bring him to me." Fairy Tale nodded their assent, and the audience was dismissed. Mercurius Castle. Hospital wing. Wendy eased herself into a wooden chair next to Charlie's bed. The Exceed, due to be released tomorrow, was sleeping soundly. Wendy knew that she herself should be sleeping too. They had returned to the castle in the dead of night, and Hisui had run out to greet them in her bedclothes, which had been amusing, as it was nearly morning. But Wendy's brain was working actively now. Her plan had been brilliant, but the generous Robin had been one step ahead of her. "We're going to have to fight him again." Wendy gently rested a hand on Charlie's sleeping form, feeling the slow moving of her torso as she breathed in and out. "Not simply to play capture the flag, we have to capture him now." She knew she'd need to be at the absolute top of her game. And Charles could get mixed up in it. Wendy's leverage last time had been that the Exceed was hospitalized and freshly awoken. Now, she could be there. Dot and Wendy could keep her safe. "The Robin hoodlums won't hurt my friends anymore," Wendy decided firmly. "I'll protect them all. Due to your careless mercy. Did you not have the chance to end things? Why are you so insistent on holding back?" "I have few rules, Brutalia," the generous Robin replied, turning his head to look away from the two as he gripped the top of his sleeved arms with both gloved palms, tight enough to turn them white. "I am no bandit. I am a hero of the people. Once we regain what was lost, we will." "Do what?" "Start a new country with the funds you've obtained, and invite all of the poor and misfortunate into it." There was a noticeable pause in the air at that. Eris herself looked surprised that the effeminate man had nothing to say about it, the youth being thin-lipped with eyes widening at that. With her own pointed ears rising upward, the pink-haired elf turned to look at the malicious spreading grin on Brutalia, twisting on her heel and swishing the hem of her dress as she raised her voice to those within the immediate surroundings. Attention everyone, the generous Robin's hidden plan, of which I've garnered the knowledge of through my most restless nights with this raucous gang, is not one of riches and rewards as he had heralded. No, it is in fact a silly dream of utopia, a lie to choral beggars, urchins, widows and miscreants to all be corralled like sheep for him to shepherd with him holding the riches in the palm of his hand. There to be hailed as the king of the weak, your generous Robin is all but the most efficient con artist of all time. What the hell? Runt questioned, coming out of the crowd with Mirror trailing behind her not far away. The shorter blonde woman looked around at the murmuring crowd of thieves and scoundrels, seeing their expressions shift from one of confusion to one of anger and vitriol. Looking over at the generous Robin, she could see his face covered by bangs, his long locks of hair swaying over his slender back as he turned to face them all. Raising her hands up, Runt exclaimed aloud, "Robin, when were you planning on telling us? Why did we have to have it sprung from Brutalia of all people? It's not like you weren't going to be paid for your work." Robin trailed off, his eyes side-glancing away, not wanting to look at the small woman in the eyes. "Ha!" Handsome bellowed, his laughter raucous as his stilt-like stride brought him into the fore of the rest of the crowd of the hoodlums. "To think I thought you small-minded. You were a clever bastard all along. But, you made a mistake, to pull a fast one on the likes of me. Children, have you all lost your mind?" Eris exclaimed, her body becoming engulfed in a bluish light that formed a halo behind her head. Clasping her hands together, she emulated with her words as her pink eyes stared them down with a warning. "If you don't settle down, I'll have to." Before she could finish speaking her piece, Brutalia gestured her hand from her hip straight towards Runt. A tether of invisible energy surged out, twisting and grasping something. For a moment Runt winced and raised her arms defensively, only to hear Mirror gasp behind her, and something speed over her head straight into the grasp of the crimson-black dressed mage. Her eyes widened palpably, eyes shrinking in her mouth agape began to bear more prominent fangs. "All I wanted. Was to be a hero." Palming the nearest thug's face, a sudden discharge of liquid surged out in such a voluminous torrent that his skull concave then exploded from the gesture. Pushing still forward past the now headless body came an explosion of water, erupting from the campsite within the mountain's valley. Like a tidal wave of blue, it swept outward towards the thugs, sweeping them all aside with nary the exception of Brutalia resisting with her energy shell wrapped around her body and Handsome leaping up above the liquid torrent preemptively along with Eris using her own magic. "Water magic?" Brutalia questioned, her eyes widening as she witnessed what looked like a lake forming from a single gesture. What was a dirty meadow at the base of several proximate peaks was now filled to the brim with liquid as if it was unleashed by an underground river. Levitating herself above its roaring movement thanks to her augmented spell, she looked over at Handsome as his eyes stared with disbelief at what he was witnessing. Turning to look ahead herself, she then felt her throat constrict and her stomach knot into place. "And no. It can't be. Robin," Eris queried out, her blue halo of light that kept her in the air caused her to watch with surprise. Looking over, she saw Runt had pulled herself and Mirror out of harm's way, despite her current level of strength depleted. A glance at the hill that Bobby was laying, it looked untouched by the new wave of an instantly formed sea. When she fixed her gaze ahead, she looked on with a sudden disbelief of the kind of person that stood in its epicenter, surrounded by disoriented to gargling thugs immersed in his newfound body of liquid. "I have a confession to make," the teal-haired boy spoke lowly, his voice more grated and rough. Raising his moistened crown they'd see turquoise scales glistening around his brow and around his eyes, speckling around his jawline and under his chin. A pair of fins extended at sharp angles from his ears, similarly jutting from his sleeved elbows up to his wrists and from the back of his calves of his heeled boots. Fang teeth bared prominently, and blue eyes were now a vivid turquoise with slitted pupils, all while projecting an immense roaring aura of magical power that gave off the silhouette of a massive turquoise-scaled beast all knew was that of a dragon. "I am not the generous Robin of folklore tale. I am Robin Lazuli," he admitted aloud, casting his gaze from Eris to a tree-hanging Runt and Mirror, and then finally to Handsome and Brutalia's stunned pair of expressions. "If you don't know that name, I'm sorry. If you do know that name, then you have my sympathy, for I wish this wasn't the case either." Lazuli, Eris thought out loud, The Per Grand Kingdom's famous artisan family. How the hell does that explain you being? Brutalia began to say, thrusting a palm forward, slicing the water apart by a bludgeon of her magic aimed straight towards him. A freakin' dragon slayer. The aforementioned Robin seemed to disappear. The spot where Brutalia struck was merely a reflection in the water. A blur of movement was seen rushing to and fro across the body water that was made manifest. The dark mage gritted her teeth, swinging her hands around to uplift the water, swirling it around and thrashing it at any hint of a shadow, repeatedly blasting it apart. "Stop moving around. Damn you," she screamed, each and every strike failing to meet its mark. Gnashing her teeth, she turned to call for aid only to see the thugs that had been subsumed in the water were now limp to maimed bodies, bereft of life, within the newly formed lake. Of course they were taken out in a single move. "Handsome, I need backup." A sudden gallop was heard and Brutalia felt her eyes widen and her head turn to comically stare at a retreating frame of the abnormally large takeover mage rushing away. "Hey, get back here, I love a good fight, but I prefer to live, thank you." Handsome countered, his frame quickly disappearing out of sight. "Useless," the enraged petulant woman screamed, shoving the water back with a horrid shriek. "All of you are useless." In the high decibels her throat released, a sphere of water, earth and air forming. Veins throbbed around her forehead down to her neck and across her face. Clenching the stave and doll tightly, she swung her fan around, scything the lake in a broad stroke towards the shadows she saw moving. Making contact, she had a dark grin spread across her face. Then, a geyser of water shot back, slamming into her protective bubble. NGH, Brutalia winced, finding herself thrown across the valley straight into the mountain's base. Stone gave way, exploding, but her shield wavered and distorted. Reopening her eyes, she saw her spiraling vortex of magic was being pierced by the jettisoning current of liquid, one that took shape with a clawed hand piercing through, with Robin's eyes glaring in a menacing glow beyond. How? The clad Crimson Queen stammered out, her control breaking down as assuredly as her defenses were. "I planned for months. I schemed, I took my opportunity, and yet, someone like you," gritting her teeth, she released her bubble and unleashed a river of energy straight into Robin's front, like a magma blast of kinetic fury. "Why is someone like you so strong?" Aris watched in awe. The blaze of light was something akin to a pure ethernano discharge. The curse magic was being amplified by her feverish emotions being fused by her innate magical power. Even the most extraordinary mage would find this barrage of pure force to be something that can't be deflected so easily. A pair of watery hands, twisting currents that moved in intense revolutions around the gloved limbs, spun around in counter movements and split the magical bludgeon in twain, leaving Brutalia stunned and breathless. "I have very few rules, Brutalia. I expected everyone under my charge to follow them," he stated, his body clad in a fabric of rushing rapid water that gave the impression of a phantom image of his own body rather than a simple exo-shell of magic like Brutalia's. Glowing pupilless eyes stared from beyond the torrent liquid threads, his voice coming out reverberated as if echoing all around her. "Do not take more than necessary. Do not fight amongst yourselves. Do not attract unnecessary attention. Do not cause needless slaughter. And, above all else." A hand pulled back, and an incantation filled the air independent of his own words. The roaring limb became a phantasmal effigy of a draconic limb formed into a massive watery fist. "Fist of, do not betray me," he howled. "The sea dragon," he intoned as he thrust his fist straight into Brutalia's face, crashing her into the mountain with enough force to splinter it upwards by hundreds of meters. Deep within the hole of the mountain, Brutalia's energy finally petered off. A swollen face, ebbing blood with whited-out eyes was splayed in an undignified posture. The stave crumbled and the doll lied in tatters in her grip along with her own telltale fan. Withdrawing from battle, the features of his draconic side receded, and once more the slender beautiful form of Robin remained. But he didn't look Aris in the eyes, nor did he look at Runt and Mirror. As the fallout of the battle began to settle, the sky itself began to shed tears and a fall of rain began to crescendo across the mountainside and over the central part of the kingdom. "Aris, I know I don't have a right to ask this because I kept this from you. But, if you can please do one last thing for me," he spoke almost too quietly to be heard, looking away as he began to walk away from the mountains and back the way they had all came. "Look after Bobby for me, all right?" The rain hid the tears well, for the generous Robin's last venture. Endless, fluctuating black in human form. A creature of ill reputation, heralding destructing wherever it went. Eyes, brilliant pearls in the inky dark, gleaming down towards a young girl who could not defend herself. The creature, so obviously draconic in shape that it was painful, did not move, however. It leered at the girl, yet it did not budge. Waiting, biding time, watching. A chill wind rushed through, frigid as winter and causing the girl to feel it in the depths of her bones. Someone, a human, followed the wind, walking in front of the draconian shadow. He was beautiful, more beautiful than she remembered seeing him, his long blue hair fluttered in the wind, and his eyes as bright as jewels. He sauntered over to the dragon's side, more serpentine than human in the sways of his movements. It was then that the young man's hand pierced the body of the dragon, it roared mightily, and the blue-haired boy slipped into the shadows. The shadows solidified, freezing over, bit by bit. The pearls of eyes became sapphires, the fluctuating darkness scales of frost. Standing before the girl was an ice dragon, who opened its mouth in a howl. In her bed, Wendy Marvell sat bolt upright, her breath ragged as if she'd just run a mile. Her clothes stuck to her body, drenched in sweat. She quickly surveyed the dark room. Doranbolt slept soundly on a cot near the foot of the bed, and at her side, a freshly recently from hospital Carla slept on peacefully, ignorant to her sudden movement. Wendy was inwardly thankful she hadn't had a fit while sleeping. These two, the dearest friends she had, did so much for her, so often, that Wendy didn't want to disturb the respite they received in sleep. Even if she herself couldn't find any. I can't tell Doranbolt, but the dreams aren't stopping. Wendy thought ruefully. But this one was different, it almost feels like an omen, is something coming. Completely awake, Wendy could hear a rumming noise fill the sky. Outside the window, she saw that the sky was dark with clouds, and as such, she couldn't tell what time it was. It wasn't simple an overcast sky, however, rain was falling heavily over the city, and what the young girl could hear as a fierce, howling wind caused the rain to slant. The pattering against the castle walls was soothing, a sound she could find comfort in, though she hadn't counted in rain. Nothing in the forecast had predicted it. Another omen, a rustling caught her attention. Wendy saw that Doranbolt was sitting up, lacking the grogginess typically associated with someone who had just woken. "Wendy, you're awake already?" asked Doranbolt, his voice clear. "What's the matter? Did something happen?" Briefly, the Slayer contemplated lying to him. She didn't want to keep worrying him. This notion vanished immediately as it came. Wendy didn't want to lie to him, to deceive him, when he'd sacrificed everything to be her friend. Thus she spilled everything, elaborating on her dream, the finer details, and how she'd seen the generous Robin combine with the shadowy figure she knew to be the lingering nightmare of Acnologia. Doranbolt was silent for a moment, his pensive. "I'll have to be honest. I've never placed much stock in omens. Perhaps it was my line of work as a spy for the Magic Council, but I've always preferred to deal with facts when possible. However," he added, as Wendy did not look thoroughly convinced, "I've been bending my thought process quite frequently as of late." He placed both hands on the girl's shoulders, gripping them firmly. "Even if it is an omen, it won't help us right now." The sky lit up outside with a flash of lightning, timed perfectly to a booming thunderclap. "When this sudden storm clears up, we'll track his scent like before," Doranbolt said, trying to sound reassuringly. "Don't dwell on it, N." Doranbolt was interrupted by a sudden quaking impact off in the far distance. This itself would have been meaningless, but it was followed by the perception of a now very familiar surge of magical energy. The generous Robin was approaching Mercurius Castle at an alarming rate. He was looking to kill. Robin's steps forward were corpse-like, unsteady, yet the lad made his way towards his would-be victim with a most assured hoisting of his blade. The glinting, liquid brand cut through the air, and Robin was sure that it had bifurcated the drunkard. Only for a flickering of movement and a blur of physical form proved him wrong. Team Wendy had materialized right in front of Robin, and reacted quickly. Max conjured a sand shield, using his magic to deter the blow of Robin's incoming blade as quickly as the pouring, whipping rains made his sand utterly worthless. Doranbolt was able to snatch the man and teleport him a ways away to safety. Wendy, meanwhile, landed neatly on the ground next to Max, her eyes burning with fire. "Good save, Doranbolt," cried Max. "Your reflexes saved us," replied Doranbolt from the distance. "It worked out better than I could have hoped." "Wendy, what should we?" Max began, but Wendy shook her head. "It's like I thought," Wendy said, not looking at either one of them. She'd wondered how she missed it before. when he'd invaded the castle previously. And when she tracked his scent deep into the Jade Mountains, something had been interfering. Not merely her thoughts, but a sweet perfume, most likely something the generous Robin himself wore. But here, in this rain, unnecessary colognes and perfumes were washed away. But a keen dragon's nose could pick up the natural scent of a human, or a rival dragon. I could smell something was off about him, and now that I'm this close with nothing to distract me, I can smell it. He smells like Natsu, or Gajeel. Max and Dorenbold understood the implications without being told. This young boy, who was weaving water together like an expert seamstress, was in fact a dragon slayer. The idea Max had thrown around in jest made far more sense now. The Jade Mountains, only easily navigable when someone like a dragon slayer was present, Max had postulated, only as a joke, that the hoodlums might have had one. It proved true. Their dragon slayer stood in the pouring rain, staring at Wendy with sunken eyes. His body possessed a strange assortment of scales, his ears finned and webbed. He almost looked like a human dragon. Oi! Why did you save me? The drunkard stared hazily from Dorenbold, to Max, to Wendy. Wait, I know you lot, you're those fairy tale mages. The second-rate ones who survived the destruction. His finger, which he'd only just noticed he was pointing, went slack. He remembered quite clearly the blow to his body and pride that Max had given him, and in the midst of all this, felt much more sober. Why did you all save me, when I said those things before? Because that's the way fairy tale is, replied Max simply. Now stop talking and get out of here. We're going to need the room. Max, Dorenbold, please help everyone evacuate the city. Wendy's directions were crisp but sudden, taking both of the fairy tale mages by surprise. I'm going to stop the generous Robin, so you all just focus on protecting everyone else. The rainfall was so constant, she almost didn't hear him. Her blue hair whipped with her head, seeing the teal-haired young man catapulting himself into the air with one strong leap of his legs. Draconic wings formed from his slender back, propelling him forward in a blur of high velocity, with water-coated claws poised to lance towards her in a single charge. Leaping away at the last second, she twisted her upper body around, palm heeling at his water-winged back, casting vernier while also unleashing a powerful gust of air straight at his back. The effect was instantaneous, shearing through the top of the building and with a loud boom crashed into the face of 1, 2, 3, then 4 buildings out the other end with a series of explosive impacts. I can't match his offensive power, but what I lack is made up for with enchantment and just as much air as there is water here, she determined, looking on with determination exuding from her amber eyes. Then, the rain stopped. Secret art. Abyssal depths, eternal expanse. A visible undulation of energy shot up like a pyre of a grave. Cyan light danced up towards the sky, and with its thrum came the command of the rain across the city. Rising out of the debris on wings of the sea came a dirtied, but still beautiful boy. With a trickle of blood dripping down his forehead over his stony face came a light of fire. Anger was beginning to brew within his teal-colored orbs. With hands outstretched, and energy flaring, the rain over Crocus halted and what continued to fall formed a dome of water, cutting off a swath of the capital from the outside world. What just happened? Wendy exclaimed, feeling her hope become doused by this new situation. Did he just stop the rain and form a barrier? His liquid spell at it, grinding the jetsam into powder and boring a hole deep into Crocus's earth with a violent crash. And then, a violent pain exploded across his skull. HNGH. His left eye blanched while the right eye clenched shut, a dainty foot coated in pressurized air slamming against his teal-colored crown as Wendy had arched herself purposefully around his blind spot. With his head ringing and his vision spinning, he could do little other than flail an arc of watery claws at her, only for her to jettison herself with another spurt of air from her mouth, bouncing over him before she'd throw both of her feet straight down on his shoulders between his artificial wings, and enchant his speed with a bit of vernier for additional velocity. A scream tore from the generous Robin's throat as he slammed deep into the hole of his own making, causing a geyser of earth to fly upwards. At the same time, the rain that had stopped in the vicinity began to pour, though with less veracity thanks to the barriers surrounding them. Thrown off course thanks to the shockwave, Wendy found herself bouncing back first onto the nearby street. Squeaking out grunts from every bounce, she rolled over onto her hands and knees, scraping them along her enchanted flesh much to her chagrin. Gaining some respite as she pushed herself upright, She turned to see the air shifted and the rain swirled like a river to pour into the hole that Robin was buried into. Smelling an accumulation of moisture, she felt her hairs stand on end along her neck as a sense of danger was being formed in the hole. Leaping up, she just barely avoided a sudden eruption of water that tore through the soil like a drill. But, instead of it being a projectile or a spell, she saw a watery-bodied silhouette akin to the young man she was battling. Soaring across the heavens, it arced around and sought purchase on the ground before bouncing straight towards her still airborne personage. Secret art. Abyssal depths. Body of the maelstrom. In a moment, Robin's body, swirling with the ferocity of a sea's vessel devouring whirlpool, swung his fist of a twisting gout of water. With eyes glowing yellow behind a shell of spiraling waves, his arm connected with Wendy's crisscrossed palms, a blast of wind parrying his watery bludgeon. And with a full turn of his upper body, he launched her across Crocus, her body shooting across it like a star and slamming into the city wall with a moist slapping sound, followed by a vicious crunch as she became embedded into its surface. Coughing up blood, eyes widening palpably, Wendy felt pain throb her whole body despite deflecting the worst of the blow. "I've got to push myself higher," she croaked out, her blurring vision seeing the incoming streak of liquid heading straight towards her. Clenching at the wall she was stuck inside of, she inhaled a slew of the storm's air, revitalizing her lungs and filling her pained figure with energy. Threefold enchantment, ×2. With widened eyes shrinking her pupils to pins, she wrenched herself out of the wall and took to the air above the spearing burst of water that tore a hole through the Crocus wall. Kicking off the skyline, she propelled herself by the very rushing air of the storm that still stirred within this barrier-encroached vista. With her eyes staring ahead, she saw the blur of teal-colored water tear across the skyline, aiming to strike her again with another direct blow. Ducking below the swift torrential currents that wrapped around Robin's arm like a spiraling armor of fierce rapids, she palmed his chest, discharging a gust of air that was enhanced by her multiplied strength and magical power. Her eyes widened with shock as it only rippled across his slender chest, barely exposing the robes beneath the twisting liquid that coated his body. In her surprise, she felt a sudden sharp pain strike her from below, as the sea dragon slayer catapulted her upwards with a sharp kick into her abdomen. Sailing high into the air, she barely had the chance to right herself before she plunged back first into the firmament that Robin had created. And, like a rubber band, she bounced back downwards at a life-threatening speed. Sky dragons, she began to inhale, her body free-falling as she took in air that swathed the enclosed arena of their choosing, her mouth expanding along with her chest, right before exhaling downward at the rushing ground she was poised to impact. Roar. A loud, bellowing howl erupted from her throat and a cyclone kicked up the water, earth and air alike in a single blast that rebounded her from the incoming floor of the Crocus Street. Spiraling around, she barely had the chance to right herself again, only for her to ram feet first into an upper-story window and emerging into an abandoned inn room, crashing across the bed and out the door into the hall. Splinters of wood showered around her with flecks of glass, parts of her skirt torn, her skin scraped and bruised but not severely injured thanks to her current slew of enchantments under a twice multiplier. He's not only stronger, but faster and tougher. It's like that armor of his enchants him just as much as my vernier, arms and armor do, she deliberated aloud, wincing as she began to push herself on all fours. She could already hear her enemy moving on the outside, approaching her vicinity. Her mind swam as she began to creep around a wall, hiding as she struggled to regain a semblance of initiative while coming up with a plan. I'm not as strong as Natsu, nor as tough as Gajiel. I have to find a way to even the odds, even for a little bit. She realized that her enchantments had been having an effect, but only for brief moments. If she was to succeed, she'd have to take it to new heights, even to ones she hadn't tested out or refined just yet. No time like the present, it's time to show Robin why I'm a fairy tale wizard. She growled out with a forced, but confident grin as her face trembled under the weight of all those who were counting on her. You're really taking your time getting out here, the haunted, echoed voice of Robin spoke as a pair of draconic talons clenched on the window frame and a pair of clawed hands clenched at the sill, a head bending in with an opaque surface of rushing water only defined by a pair of golden eyes behind its passively moving surface. I was about ready to drag you out. I'm not finished giving you the beating you deserve, wannabe slayer. I'm not a wannabe, Wendy spat back, her hands clenched and her feet stepping forward with a furrow on her brow. I'm Wendy Marvell, my mother and teacher was Grandini, my family is fairy tale, and you're acting incorrigibly. That last bit may be true, Robin intoned, the yellow spotlights for eyes shrinking a midge as if imitating a narrowing of one's optics. But I'll be sung as a hero in the ballads once I've retrieved my hat. You were a mistake, after all. You should be dead like the rest of your guild. I wish they didn't die, and I wish I wasn't separated from them. The pain is so great I wake up screaming at night, Wendy confessed, her face grimacing and teeth clenching hard enough to make her molars grind. Spreading her legs, her fists balling up, a sudden howling gust of air swept past the windowsill, perching Robin and swimming around her in a visible mantle of colored air. The walls buckled, the floor cracked and the roof tore as the wind became enchanted, and by extension so did the body of the Sky Dragon Slayer. Amplified, augmented and brought to a further height, the light soon became an incandescent spiral that brought her blue hair upwards in a spiraling torrent of cobalt tresses, her skirt sweeping around her legs and rushing around her chest. Eyes had her pupils turn into draconic slits and fangs became pronounced, all at once a howling torrent of a white-scaled dragon blowing the building's top off its seams, revealing Robin looking back with unseen awe at the newly improved Wendy. Threefold enchantment, ×3, Wendy declared, her eyes gaining a pigment of cyan within her normally hazel irises. I'll defeat you here, Robin, and show you why you're wrong. A clap of thunder, one of numerous tonight, was what finally broke Charles out of her slumber. The small-bodied, white-furred feline felt her eyes shake in place as lids blinked rapidly. The flash of light from the outside only cast a brief shadow, illuminating the darkened room she was reclined in. The bed with white sheets and surrounded by flowers did little to comfort the gnawing feeling she had. And then, a flash across the bedroom brought her vision to a rain-filled ruined street. What is this? She began to choke out, shivering as if she was feeling the cold rain that was pelting her fur despite being indoors. Is this a vision? She heard a familiar cry, and from the spot she clung to was from up high. She couldn't make out her surroundings, only what was right in front of her. A torrential spiral of water, boring straight into Wendy, her body flayed as her head reared back and let out a wordless gasp. Even as a shower of blood mingled with the watery gale she saw the one who was responsible, the face darkened by the lightless environment, but illuminated briefly in a flash of lightning with telling blue eyes, a cherub oval face and sweeping teal hair that whipped behind a slender back that was covered by soot, blood and bruises. And then, just as quickly as the flash of the vision vanished, she felt something from the outside. Come on, we have to hurry, city's gone to hell because of those damn brigands. Voices echoed outside of her bedroom, causing the Exceed's ears to turn in the direction, her face looking in the direction of the door. She heard men clinking armor on, obviously having just got out of bed and rushing past her room without care to their surroundings. Bells rang beyond the tumultuous storm, giving her more clarity of the current state of the environment. Looking out of her window, she saw something that caused her eyes to contract and her mouth go agape. A massive barrier of water encircled the western gate, with its district cut off from the outside by the dome. And beyond it, an unmistakable series of flashes of light, with magical aura as the catalyst. One the color of cyan and the other a deep cobalt, each one clashing violently and giving off the vaguest impressions of ancient eldritch beings, those of the extinct dragons of old. Wendy, Charles exclaimed, her body bolting upright and unlatching the window. Despite a gale of the storm hitting her in the face, soaking her fur, she extended her wings and called upon her native magic to propel her forward. Despite the aches she felt, she propelled herself towards the source, with a determined if not panicked look across her face. I won't let you die, Wendy. I won't abandon you to this fate. Her head plunged into the barrier, mind steeled at the prospect of being repelled or even harmed. But instead, she saw something that brought her dread. An entire swirling ocean separating herself from the distant lights that made up what she thought was only a few meters away, but now was certainly even far more vast of a distance. Within this water she felt a swirl of movement, simulating the torrential sea she had experienced not but a short time ago. Her blood went cold, her spine chilled and her head swished back and forth, before throwing herself out of the dome of water into the sky with wings shivering in place behind her back. Wendy, I can't. She began to sob, covering her aching, wet bandaged chest. Even as the storm raged outside, her body floating passively in the sky's downpour, she couldn't help but look with understandable fear at the swirling dome of liquid that seems to absorb the rainfall as it lands on its surface. If I take that plunge, will I get to you at all? This magic seems to spawn an entire sea, and I may drown in that time before I. As she was rambling in her thoughts, the memory of the vision she bore witness to brought everything into clarity. If she hesitated, let her fear get the better of her now, how would she be able to ever live this down? This was her only chance to avert the horrid future she kept seeing. This was the moment she was to seize and make fate twist in the way she wishes, rather than await it with dread. Taking a deep breath, Charles raised her head and, with a pair of puffed cheeks, she zoomed straight into the barrier once more with even more gusto. Max speed, a white blur pierced the roiling sphere of water, parting the artificial currents and racing straight towards the light she knew was Wendy's magical aura. No matter what obstacle lies between us, I'll always come for you, Wendy, I'll always protect you, even if it costs me everything. Robin, the peasants aren't worth your empathy. Focus on things that matter. Eyes widened, irises vanishing, and the young man erupted from the wall of the barrier he created, reappearing in full adornment of maelstrom armor. Wendy herself was in a defensive stance, anticipating his emergence, though still looked alarmed as he crossed the gap with a swift bound that left her leaping back as he impacted the ground with a watery splash that leveled the structures still standing in their proximity. Re-emerging from the water, he blurred forth and slammed a clawed hand into a palm heel thrust of Wendy's, the clash of water and wind casting a howling twister around the pair as they danced in the air. "This is your fault," he roared out, throwing another monstrous punch that forced Wendy to block with a raised arm, sending her flying backwards across the skyline as he followed up with another flap of his liquid wings, punching at her raised arms with palpable claps of spiraling liquid meeting wind-encircled flesh. I was to be a hero to the helpless, the disenfranchised, and the weak. A third punch thrown and Wendy leaned back, letting it pass over her harmlessly while she released a shrill cry of Sky Dragon's Claw that connected with his face, tearing off his swirling rapids mask and cutting his cheek in the process. Grasping her extended foot, he'd slam her into a house's roof, of which she bounced off and leapt back to slam both of her feet into his chest, exploding his armor and throwing him across the air in an uncontrollable spin. On his own body to make a charge. If she could somehow take advantage of his counterintuitive means of attack, she could. The air surrounding his fang. Just as she made this discovery, Robin's own eyes widened at the air suddenly being siphoned from his own corkscrewing weapon. He'd see it flow from his upward raised lance and straight towards her mouth, an action that left her completely open. "I won't give you the chance to recover," Robin snarled, hefting the weapon forward, bending his knees and launching himself with a powerful forward leap towards her. "Now die." It was here, that time slowed. During the Sea Dragon Slayer's motion towards her, something peculiar rippled within the ceiling of the eternal expanse. A white form, blinking from its depths, undulated outward before rocketing outward with a sonic boom left in its wake. The streak of alabaster curved around, a streak of light that veered straight towards the occupied flank of Robin, whose sight had narrowed into tunnel vision, leaving him unable to see the blurring form that connected with his skull with a sudden jarring impact. NGH. He veered off course, the drilling lance swinging to the left and then to the right as his weapon didn't aim true as Wendy reoriented in time to see what had struck his skull. "I made it, in time," Charles croaked out, bouncing off Robin's head and onto the street behind the charging Robin. With eyes turning into slits, and the enchantment flaring up back to full power, Wendy leapt forward towards her adversary while bending just enough to avoid its razor tip. The outer rotating drill of water slashed her side, leaving a gout of blood from her body, but she had all but blocked it out as a howling torrent of her magical energy formed around her fist, aiming straight towards the disoriented face of Robin Lazuli. "Fist of the Sky Dragon," Wendy cried out, her knuckles slamming straight into Robin's nose. The force of it cracked it, and then throttled his body backwards, with his drill dispelling in a splash of water as he'd slammed straight into the remnants of the gate behind him. Soon after, the barrier of his own making dispelled, collapsing in a shower of heavy rainfall that lathered the now collapsed Wendy. Clutching her wounded side, she grimaced in pain but looked over to Charles, her eyes watering as she looked at the barely conscious exceed with gratitude. "Charles. You saved me," Wendy declared, closing her eyes as tears fell freely from her face. "Thank you. I just followed the light," Charles weakly replied, still breathing heavily to refill the void from her lungs, having no room to be filled during her imperceptible journey across the abysmal watery depths. "And before I lost my strength, I saw you. And where my vision I saw." "It's all right, Charles," the cobalt-haired girl replied, cradling her side as she lied onto her back, and looked up at the still raining sky, clouds beginning to part as rays of sunlight began to grace the city below. "Because, in the end, I knew we would make it. 'Cause that's what it means to trust your friends in fairy tale, right? Chuckling despite herself, Charles too laid on her back as she cradled her now freshly sore skull. Yes. Yes it is. As Dorenbolt soon returned with Max, recovering the injured Charles and the wounded Wendy, Arcadios found Robin Lazuli unconscious and in bad shape from his own participation in this battle. The sky began to clear up, and after a long, fearsome exchange, the hoodlums had finally been defeated. Fairy tale had won. Inwardly, Charles didn't believe that she had any proper place at this ceremony, and had Wendy not insisted she come, would have stayed behind instead. Even though she'd been there for the final moment, and managed to save her best friend, Charles did not believe that any accolades should go to her. But she decided to tough it out for the sake of Wendy. Dorenbolt was no stranger to honors, having earned a few in the service of the Magic Council, and thus he took these in stride. Max, however, was flabbergasted. Friends of the royals. That's a lot of responsibility to give to regular Joes like us. And yet it is well earned, replied Hisui smoothly. Nothing that you all did for us is undeserving of anything less. My father and I deliberated, and it was only due to it being considered improper conduct that we did not create a new award of prestige for what you did for us. You saved not only Fiori, but numerous countries by accepting this mission. The Lazuli hat contained far more than our treasury. It is currently a matter being discussed by countries such as of Veronica, 7, among others how to divide it back among the victims of Lazuli's theft. You are heroes to far more than our country. Wendy had nothing to say to this. She hadn't set out to become a hero when this started, she only wanted to preserve funding and reputation for her guild. If all these countries really know about this, I think we might have succeeded and then some. Wendy couldn't see the expression plastered over her face, and was surprised to see Max, Dorenbolt, Charles, Arcadios, and Hisui all beaming at her. Wendy tilted her head, confused. Is something the matter? Charles shook her head. No, Wendy, but you're smiling, well and truly, smiling. She's right, replied Dorenbolt, wearing a toothy grin of his own. I didn't think I'd see a real smile on your face so soon. The Dragon Slayer girl had never given that consideration before. She knew she'd smiled before, but had it actually been so different? Had they been forced? The young girl placed a hand to her face, as if trying to feel the difference in her smile now. This only caused Hisui to giggle. Wendy, I know you've been through quite an ordeal, more than even the rest of your guild members, Hisui began. Max did not object. It was true that many in Fairy Tale were suffering from the loss of their friends, but Wendy had been there to see it. She was young, and it impacted her the most. But now, things are going to be different. Opportunities will open up, doors you didn't know existed before will swing open. To be frank, I'm looking forward to see the sort of path you pave for yourself. Our little Wendy making a name for herself already, said Max, pride in his voice. Chin up, kid, he added, as Wendy averted her eyes from Hisui's, embarrassed by the praise. You don't really think Urza or Mira Jane became the Titania and the demon by being humble, do ya? It's just, the rest of Wendy's sentence was drowned out in her mumblings. Her face flushed to resemble a ripened beet. Never you fear, Arcadios laughed heartily, folding up the parchment and tucking it away in his armor. He patted the section of his chest where the parchment lay, making sure it was unable to move. A little humility goes a long way, no one gets far on arrogance alone, and young Wendy is a shining beacon of modesty. She'll go far with that attitude. Agreed, Hisui replied. She raised a hand, and motioned in two robed figures, both of who held in their hands plush, purple cushions. Something metallic and crimson glinted under the palace's lacrimal lighting. The figures strode towards Team Wendy, and, leveraging the cushion in a single hand, pulled up the glinting object for all to see. It was a medal, ornately designed, glowing a deep, vivid crimson. The name suited it well. Whoever had cut the jewel used to make this had painstakingly made it resemble a rose in bloom, down to the intricate shape of the petals. The jewel rose was attached to a jade-colored cloth ribbon. The robed figures lowered one each onto the necks of Wendy, Max, Charles, and Dorenbolt before stepping back. Each member of Team Wendy was now adorned with the blooming rose medal, marking them as heroes of Fury. The cut jewel on at the end of the cloth shone brightly upon each of their chests, glinting crimson. If you wish to return home post-haste, we shall see that you are escorted to Magnolia under the supervision of the Cherry Blossom Holy Knight Squadron itself, Arcadios bowed with respect and deference to the comrades he had fought with to reclaim the riches of his benefactors. Any sum of jewels would make you a target for rogues and brigands of all sorts, but 50 billion is its own brand of madness. We want to see to it that fairy tale gets its reward without issue. We accept the generosity, replied Dorenbolt easily. He knew that Arcadios spoke the truth. Carrying that giant sum, even if they carried it in the largest denomination of bills the castle could provide, would only lead to trouble. Wendy was still recovering, and while he and Max were as well as they could be, fending off bandits while defending Wendy and Charles could prove troublesome. To be truthful, we were considering being on our way as early as the morning after tomorrow. It isn't every day we get to come to Crocus, after all. I like the sound of that, Max grinned. I'd be willing to bet anything there's a lady in this city waiting for someone like me. Yes, and I'm sure she's waiting with the city guards at arm's length, Charles said dryly. Wendy stepped forward towards the throne, her eyes firmly making contact with those of Hisui. Jade met Chocolate in a moment of tense silence. What happened to Robin after I won? It was a hard way to phrase it. Had no one told her she'd won, she might have actually assumed that the battle had been lost. After Wendy and Robin's final exchange, Wendy had awoken a day later in the hospital wing of the Mercurius Castle. She had no memory of what become of her opponent, and neither Max nor Dorenbolt had said anything during their visits. Arcadios opened his mouth, as if to say something, but Hisui raised a hand and cut him off. She's no child, Arcadios. We should be honest with her. She is the hero that saved our city, after all. Hisui never broke eye contact with Wendy the entire time, and continued speaking. Robin Lazuli has officially been delivered into the custody of the Magic Council, with the assistance of Dorenbolt. His sentencing, such as it is, will be carried out by the will of Grand Doma. I see. Wendy didn't know what to expect. Robin and the Robin hoodlums had committed great crimes against not merely the magical world, but the ordinary one as well. They had used their abilities to steal from multiple countries across the land, and no matter the reason, had placed the economies of nations continent-wide at risk. She should have known that Robin would be given some punishment, yet part of her had hoped he'd become a friend, even in the middle of their battle. That's to be expected. Hisui stood up, striding from her throne towards Wendy. The height difference was very apparent, the young child standing next to teenage princess. For a moment, Wendy felt as if she was standing next to Urza or Lucy again. The Princess of Fury knelt down, cupping Wendy's face in her hands, and kissed the young girl's forehead. "Why, Your Grace," Arcadios protested. "You're a child of purity, Wendy," commended Hisui. "I feel comfortable giving responsibilities and rewards to one such as you. I do regret that such a young boy was handed over to the authorities, but there's nothing we could have done." Standing back, Hisui smiled comfortingly. "Formally, as Princess Hisui E. Fury, acting in the stead of my father, Toma E. Fury, thank you for your services to the Crown of Fury. Your heroism will never be forgotten, and you will always be welcome here." Silence. The man's words, his sudden appearance, his even more sudden disappearance, his mannerisms, all weighed on their minds. Wendy felt there was more to what he said than the mere ramblings of a wanderer. She didn't trust him. No, it was precisely the opposite, and yet that was why she gave credibility to his words. It's something about his eyes. Wendy had never once felt so uncomfortable looking into the eyes of another person. Not Urza, for who one eye was fake. Not Master Hades, for who one eye was a gateway to all that was evil. His eyes, they weren't looking at me. And his smell, it was so strange. Wendy mulled over everything about this man as they approached their exit from the city. As they approached, Max waved with a bright smile. Astride their chariot were 4 soldiers, clad in the armor of the Cherry Blossom Holy Knight Squadron, who had already mounted their steeds. They were clearly ready to be off in return, lacking any of Arcadios' professional manner. The Cherry Blossom Holy Knight Squadron commander, however, was unable to leave Hisui's side for something as simple as an escort mission, even if it was to escort the heroes of Fury themselves. Duranold, sitting on the grass with his back resting on the chariot, merely looked worn. When he saw Wendy and Charlie's troubled expressions, however, the young man became immediately alert. "Wendy, you're early," Dorenbolt said. "Did something happen on the way here? You look like you saw a ghost." Wendy and Charles looked at each other. Well, Wendy launched into an explanation about the man they had encountered, not even thinking of hiding such a strange occurrence from Dorenbolt. She'd asked the man to be her friend, he deserved to know about something as strange as this. Dorenbolt rested a finger on his chin, his face contemplative. A traveling merchant that delivers cryptic warnings. For someone like myself, who has never placed much stock in omens, he seems like a bad omen on legs. I'll make a note to report him to the Magic Council, but for now, I don't think we can do anything about him, or his warning. Inwardly, Dorenbolt didn't want to ignore it either. I can't tell you how to act on it, only that we can't dwell on it. If you think his advice worth heeding, I'll follow you. Dorenbolt replied simply. Dorenbolt was right, dwelling on the ramblings of a complete stranger right now was pointless. While Wendy couldn't give the man's words no significance at all, she didn't believe they had any bearing on her right now. Shoving the merchant to the back of her head, she allowed Dorenbolt to help her into the chariot, followed quickly by Charles, Max, and Dorenbolt himself. Seated comfortably in the chariot, Wendy poked her head out from behind the curtain, inhaling crocus air for the last time. Let's go home, everyone. The Emerald Mountains, deep mountain range. Lahar found himself unsatisfied. It wasn't every day that one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country was disbanded, even more so, to have the task be carried out by Fairy Tail, rather than the council's own Rune Knights. To say he was disappointed with the events would not do it justice, but Lahar knew there was something to be said for beggars being choosers. And indeed he would not be choosy about this situation, for, bound with all manner of restraints, was a mass of bolts and straps with a head attached, that of Handsome. The pyramid-headed member of the Robin Hoodlums protested violently, but his mouth was restrained as well as his limbs. The council intended to take no chances with this man. In Handsome's mind, this was the ultimate indignity, not to have lost, but to have been taken by surprise. He had imagined, if he was taken to prison, a glorious last stand, facing off against the council's agents. But this, to have been ambushed mere days after fleeing his former benefactor, he couldn't stand it. I suppose we'll have to content ourselves with this, Lahar grumbled. Straightening his black hair, which had grown tousled in their attempt to capture Handsome, a deep frown set on his face. The head captain of the custody enforcement surveyed Handsome with the utmost distaste. The leader was quite literally delivered to us, and we snagged one of the big names. But the other 5 have eluded us. Lahar went over their code names in his head: Brutalia, Runt, and Mirror. Then there's the elf and the assassin, who also remain at large. Can we consider this a victory simply because the head conspirator was brought in? Lahar and his knights were no hunters. They'd found Handsome merely because of a reliable lead, nothing more. With the other 4 lost to the other, and their abilities affording them multiple methods of concealment, he wasn't banking on finding them anytime soon. He cursed under his breath. At this same time, one of his knights hailed him down. "Head captain, sir," shouted the man. "We're receiving an urgent call from the council." The sudden proclamation startled Lahar. He hadn't been expecting contact with the council until he'd returned in the next day. What could possibly be so urgent that it had required calling him out on the field? He made his way toward the lacrima, through which he could see the image of a wizened old man. The man had one good eye, pointed ears, and long facial hair. "Org," Lahar bowed respectively, even more surprised to see the Magic Council's second seat having reached out to him personally. "Forgive me for asking, but what's the meaning of this abrupt call? I wasn't required to report back until tomorrow." "You're being summoned back," Org's harsh voice came through curtly. "We've received an unexpected visitor, and it seems we're going to need to reconsider a few things." "An unexpected visitor? Who?" Org brought up an image in front of his communications lacrima. It was a face Lahar knew well. The entire Magic Council remembered it. That's impossible," gasped the head captain, feeling his blood chill. "I'll return immediately." Several people crowded around Team Wendy, the recognizable faces of Biska, Alzak, Nab, Lackey, among others, offering heartfelt congratulations, pats on the back, and whooping cheers. Max took it all in stride. Charles and Dorenbolt were indifferent, and Wendy was suitably embarrassed. If she'd been blushing before, the poor girl's face now resembled a tomato with blue hair. Before she could protest, or try to give the credit to anyone else, her guildmates unleashed a flood of questions. "It's been the talk of the town," Lackey admitted, beaming as she straightened her glasses. "You 4 are all anyone wants to talk about right now, the heroes of Fury, right?" "We heard you got medals," Warren added. "Can we see them? What was it like to fight another dragon slayer?" asked Vegeta curiously. Don't crowd them, Kanana called out, fresh from serving a frothing mug of beer to one of the tables. Besides, shouldn't you tell them what happened? At this, Team Wendy entered a full alert mode, and it became clear that Kanana may have chosen her phrasing poorly. Worry crossed Wendy's face. Dorenbolt immediately became wary. Charles glanced toward Wendy to see how she was reading the situation, and Max paled at the anticipation of possible bad news. Should we be concerned? Dorenbolt was the first one to brave a question. No, not at all, replied Kanana cheerfully. Come on over to the bar. You won't believe this, but we've got new guild members. We have. New guild members. Confusion swept up in the place of paranoid feelings. Dorenbolt was the most recent addition to Fairy Tail's roster of kooky personalities, and if one didn't count him, Wendy and Charles were the newest inducts into Fairy Tail's guild. It was quite a shock to hear that new blood had joined the ranks. Team Wendy pushed past the people crowding them, until Fairy Tail's bar was in full view. Sitting on one of the stools was a familiar head of light blue hair, grinning smugly at the new arrivals. Rather than his previous, form-fitting attire, he now wore a long, dark blue robe, which flared out on either side, revealing tights-covered, crossed legs, still ending in high-heeled boots. A deliberate cut in the outfit revealed his navel, on which one could see a Fairy Tail brand that matched the color of his hair. He was the center of attention, receiving furtive glances from many in the guild and enjoying the focus. At his side stood two beautiful women, both of who also displayed a Fairy Tail brand on their left and right shoulders. Wendy, grinned Robin Lazuli, raising a glass in her direction. You're late, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments. Ray What If signing off.